Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Journalism and New Media Studies, SOJNMS, Bachelor Programmes, Bachelor of Arts, Journalism and Digital Media, BAJDM, Semester I, BNM 022 Techniques of Reporting, Block-1 Basics of News, Unit-2 News Sources, 2.0 Introduction. News that is filled up on pages of our newspapers or phones are made possible with the help of individuals or teams acting as sources of news. Information which is considered as news is collected in an organized way that involves personnel who are specifically trained to track news developments and select news from a wide variety of events that transpire in the world around us. Needless to say, news is dependent on news sources and the news organization's ability to get the news out to the audience in a timely, news being a perishable commodity, reliable, and presentable manner. News, therefore, is a complex process that involves selection of events that are deemed newsworthy. This selection implies three things. 1. A certain class of people who know as journalists and editors make the selection and decide what we must read as news. 2. It inherently means that certain people or sources have privileged access to media than others. And 3. It mandates a routinized functioning of the media which presents stories in a specified format and in a factory-like content production to produce news 24/7. In this unit, we shall discuss different aspects of news sources including the variety of news sources available to news organizations and the social construction of news, the source-media relationship and organizational routines in media including the hierarchical distribution of work among a pool of trained reporters who use these sources to produce their daily staple of news. The unit lists different news sources available to a news organization, reporter while differentiating between them from the point of view of journalistic routines, ethics and practices. 2.1 Learning Outcomes. After completing this unit, you should be able to times describe different news sources, times understand the usage of various sources and describe their significance in the structuring of a news report, and times explain reliability and credibility of sources. 2.2 Sources of news. News sources can be people who journalists interview, talk to, quote, observe, or meet to construct a news story. They provide the basic information which is the building block of a news story. At the same time, no two sources can lend the same meaning to a news story. Since the role of journalists is interpretational, framing it or mapping it in a certain social or cultural context, and thus making news understandable to the audiences, the choice of one source over another is often ideological. 2.2.1 Reporters and correspondents, as you are aware, are the backbone of any newspaper, television news channel or a news website. They are literally the face of the news organizations. In fact, today news has become so reporter-centric that news channels and newspapers market their brands in the names of their reporters. Competent, well-known and experienced reporters are thus central to any news organization which aspires to earn its readers' or viewers' trust and claim to practice high-quality journalism. Reporting itself is a highly specialized and demanding profession that requires years of training and commitment to journalism. Young reporters have to sit with their editor for hours and patiently learn to report, make contacts and get skilled into the fine art and craft of reporting. They have to learn to create a news story which follows well-established conventions of the narrative form, see Schudson, 1982, language codes, hierarchy of sources and seamless editing that hides the frames in which meaning of the story is contained. Graham Murdoch points out how the routinized and fixed way of presenting news within familiar frameworks has two important consequences. It recharges and extends the definitions and images in question, and it also conveys the eternal continuity and stability of the social structures and order. News gathering requires certain acumen and, as they say, a nose for news. Cub reporters are usually groomed into specialized areas of news, which has resulted into what news organizations call the beat system, categorized into national, political, metro city, business, crime, sports, legal, science and environment, education, health, entertainment, etc. In this division of work between beat reporters, special correspondents and the general reporters, each are trained differently. This also implies that the beat reporter has to spend plenty of time in the field building contacts with key persons who will eventually be his/her sources, often resulting in a relationship of mutual cooperation with their sources. For example, a city crime reporter must have adequate contacts in the police department, the courts and locals who will then be his/her informers in case some crime happens. While the reporter gets to file the story, the sources attain a proximity to the press and get certain perks such as free publicity when quoted in the story. As established, time is of supreme value in news. A reporter could be reprimanded for not covering an event in his/her beat on time when other channels have already begun flashing it. Source proximity could play a crucial role in getting the information first. In a breaking news culture, marked by knee-jerk reactions, sensationalism, and where news outlets are competing to be the first to report, the credibility and aptitude of the reporter who fails the time test is severely put under the scanner. This mad rush to be the first to break a story can lead to instances of poor journalism when reporters fail to verify or cross-check what their sources are saying in the interest of time. This can also lead to a serious violation of the principle of factual reportage. After applying satisfactory checks and balances, the reporters cultivate trustworthy sources who give them information from time to time. Some of these include politicians, ministries, influential individuals, government officials, social activists, spokespersons, public intellectuals, and even other reporters covering the same beat in rival news organizations. Gans, 1979, enlists 6 considerations that determine the suitability of a source to a journalist. These are: I. Past suitability, 2. Productivity, 3. Reliability, 4. Trustworthiness, v. Authoritativeness, 6. Articulateness, fields of journalism such as investigative journalism that results in exclusives, requires more time and tact in the field, chasing information that is not easy to unearth. Investigative reporters develop contacts who can tip off classified information or leak information in public interest to spark off a nationwide debate. Investigative reportage can also be used as an effective safeguard against attempts by governments or powerful groups to manipulate information or create consensus on issues without its full deliberations in the public domain. The problem is that most news organizations do not have the resources or the time to let their reporters go on such investigative trails for weeks before it can come out in the form of stories. Bhushan, 2013. The breaking news ethos has in that sense eroded many long-held journalistic principles of accuracy and objectivity. The investigative news culture is fast withering away and giving place to sensationalism and entertainment-oriented news. Another phenomenon that has had a far-reaching impact on how news is gathered is the news organization's reliance on freelance stringers who are paid on per news story basis, helping cut down the expenses of retaining full-time reporters. Roy, 2011, besides providing geographical proximity, GANs, 1979, to bureau reports. Reports from several bureaus across the country and abroad are an important aspect of the routine of news gathering. At the level of the bureaus, the reporters are less inundated with assignments when compared with the head offices and therefore are able to spend more time in the field. The logic behind setting up bureaus is geographical closeness, given that reporters from their own native states or region have a better understanding of the political, economic and cultural dynamics of the region and therefore are better placed to cover local news stories. To point three news agencies, the modern form of the press is linked to the rise and consolidation of the news agencies. News agencies are a steady source of news for media outlets. Each news organization subscribes to a large number of national and international news agencies or wire services to keep a close tab on all that is happening in different parts of the world where they can neither set their own bureaus nor afford to send reporters. For example, maintaining a foreign correspondent in all the capitals of the EU throughout the year will be extremely expensive and out of reach for most newspapers, TV news channels and news websites based in New Delhi. It would also mean that they cut themselves out from news developments in these places. However, subscribing to Reuters or AP, Associated Press, would ensure a minute-by-minute update on every event that transpires in those countries with their vast network of reporters sending stories from the ground. The rise and consolidation of news agencies. Early founders of news agencies such as Bernhard Wolff in Germany, Baron von Reuter in England and Charles Louis Havas in France started out just like any other business venture. They focused on regions and places where technologies of printing were available. In 1859, the Big Three formed a cartel, or a ring virtually dividing the world into three parts for news collection. Reuters was to cover the British Empire, North America, and most of Asia and Egypt. Havas, the French Empire, the Latin countries of Europe, and South America, and Wolff, the remainder of Europe. Cuthbert, 1980. With the expansion in Industrial Revolution, printing press, capitalist economies, these news agencies were organized early in the 19th century to quickly provide latest market reports to traders and business houses that needed them. There have been considerable shifts in the ownership patterns of news agencies from initial days of private ownership to the post-World War period when it was realized that the news agencies should be owned by newspapers subscribing to their services and not by individuals. Soon after World War II, when most countries in Asia gained freedom from colonial rule, many national news agencies were set up. As news agencies grew and expanded, their potential for quick transmission of political news and information between different countries became apparent, as was also realized that they could provide a bulk of information to newspapers. This made the business of news agencies very lucrative, as many newspapers wanted to report about events from places where their correspondents could not be sent due to economic reasons. The birth of the Associated Press can be attributed to attempts to break the European cartel and partly stemming from cultural and ideological reasons to reduce the control of the cartels over news flow. By 1859, the AP was able to reorganize its business in the American region to get a near-exclusive hold of the American territory, signing a contract with the European cartel that each agency should create the news report in its own marked territory and provide it for the use of the other contracting agencies. Reuters was the first news agency to set operation in India, in fact Asia, from Mumbai in 1886, it expanded its operations to other countries under the British rule. The opening of the Suez Canal and installation of a direct cable link between London and the East made a major difference in the speed with which messages could be transmitted. Reuters and its subsidiary agency, the Associated Press of India, had a monopoly in India until the Press Trust of India was formed by the Indian Newspapers Press Trust of India, PTI, was incorporated on 27 August 1947 under the Indian Companies Act 1913. The story of the growth and evolution of PTI, which is the largest news agency of the country, is itself a saga of the growth of journalism in India. Raghavan, 1987. The PTI has an extensive news collection and distribution system in the country. Collectively, they put out more than 2,000 stories and 200 photographs a day to feed the expansive appetite of the diverse subscribers, who include the mainstream media, the specialized presses, research groups, companies, and government and non-governmental organizations. What happened in the US in the 1920s was repeated in the 1970s this time by the developing countries, who found that under the monopoly control of the Western news agencies, the developing world could neither get fair access to news, being always underreported, nor would it be represented justifiably. These countries felt that only negative news about disasters, underdevelopment, poverty, malnutrition and other problems in their part of the world would be considered newsworthy by the Western media. As a result, the 1970s were impregnated by widespread rejection and protests against the international news flow imbalance between the core and the periphery. Hemlink, 1990. This was also the time marked by UNESCO's free flow ideology, which assumed that individual information access as supreme and a fundamental human right. The doctrine evolved from two UN declarations. First, 1946 UN Declaration on Freedom of Information, which placed much significance to free flow of information between countries, and second, the UN Declaration on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which looked upon freedom of information as a fundamental human right, as evident from the Article 19 of the Declaration. By the mid-1970s, there was a growing demand for democratization of information, particularly from the Third World countries, most of which got organized under the umbrella of the New World Information and Communication Order, NWICO, which called for a new order as a move away from the old order of information imperialism. All through the MacBride roundtables, culminating in the significant report, Many Voices, One World, which were commissioned by the UNESCO to address the North-South information imbalance, among a host of other disparities, as voiced by scholars and media persons in Asia, Africa and Latin America, there was a need to reduce the vertical, one-way flow of news and rely on local, indigenous sources, including establishment of more regional news agencies. Using agencies' content, let us now see how the news organizations use these wire services or the wire copies to make news. Since the news agencies have to cater to many nations who might have different stakes and interests in given news situation, the copy made by them is mostly an objective statement of the facts as they occurred, with minimum interpretation or commentary. The input department has several trainees at the desk and reporters who monitor at least 4 to 5 international and national news agency updates all the time to alert the news desk or the editorial if something significant happens. It is then taken up, cleaned, or more inputs added to it and ready to be placed in the bulletin or the newspaper. News agency copies are considered to be reliable and extremely authentic sources of news, so the newspapers don't have to bother about checking the facts and usually tend to attribute the agency whose news is sourced. Television channels subscribe to the audiovisual footage like by APTN and ANI in India, which is sent along with the story, and use the clips for their stories. For example, the Turkey-Syria earthquakes that took place in February 2023 are procured from the clips sent by the wires and could be edited together to produce one complete news package of how the earthquakes looked like. Since it is not possible or cost-effective to send an organization's own reporters to the multiple disaster locations, on the other hand, in the case of domestic coverage or news that occurs in India, a news organization would have the advantage of subscribing to copies from the PTI, ANI, Univarta, and other news agencies in the country, and also would be able to send one's own reporters who could reach the location in a few hours to provide live coverage. Generally, in case of important news stories, news organizations use wire copies as a buffer for the time their own reporters take to reach the location. Besides, reporters provide first-hand accounts of what is happening, meet eyewitnesses, and create several stories around that one event, making it exclusive to that newspaper or channel. It is this that makes two news reports different even though the event was the same. Besides, for more newsworthy events with a greater national significance, reporters can be lined up for live discussions in each successive bulletin or can provide news updates so long as the story is developing, which could run into days. In that sense, a wire copy is often used as a first reaction, and later the news organizations prefer to cover the events happenings in their own style. Activity 1. Pick up any day's newspaper. Read all the news and write their source. How many news are taken from news agencies? Write the names of those news agencies and write your observation on the importance of news agencies for a newspaper. 2.2.4 Individual sources. Most news organizations insist on getting government or established sources of information to add weight to their stories. As discussed above, this is how media tend to reinforce the definition of the powerful few and impose a single meaning to the event. Stuart Hall's concept of the primary definers of news succinctly sums up this aspect of news. As a result of pressures of time and resource allocation coupled with the journalistic practice of objective and balanced reporting, reporters tend to get statements from accredited sources, i.e. accredited representatives of powerful organizations who become what Hall calls the primary definers of the topics. This initial framework sets the tone and parameters of the discussion on the given topic. In this way, media reproduce the dominant ideas, the ideologies of the ruling class, and are often in subordination to these powerful institutions, in contradiction to the normative ideal of the press being a watchdog of society. Besides the institutional sources, reporters often turn to subject experts, academics or known faces in a particular field to lend a new dimension to the story. For example, a story on women's reservation bill will usually consist of interviews of at least 2 women MPs representing 2 different political parties in favor of the bill and maybe another woman MP against the bill. In addition to these, the reporter must try and get a known women rights activists and a bite from the general public to flesh out the debate from different points of view. Neutral sources that do not have a direct stake in the issue provide the much-needed balance, but are often last in the priority of sources. 2.2.5 Online sources and social media platforms. Internet have radically altered the way news is collected, disseminated, and consumed. The significance of the Internet as a source of news is very well documented in the literature on online news and social media. Newspapers and TV news channels keep a track of what news items are posted on different news portals and websites on a daily basis. In the present-day digital world, Twitter, see Hermida 2010, Facebook and other social media platforms are emerging as instantaneous and popular sources of news with almost all politicians at national and international levels, political parties, organizations, and celebrities. Newsmakers having their own Twitter accounts and Facebook pages directly connect with the public and feed reporters with the latest information. 2.3 Reliability and credibility of sources. Journalistic practice relies on factual information. A news story normally is made up of interview bites or talking heads who give their accounts or comments on an event. A journalist's job is to pad the story with the comments or bites in a logical sequence and add voiceovers plus visuals so that the event can make sense to the audiences. The sources in that sense are the building blocks of the story. In routine practice of fast-paced news production, reporters do not have the time or the resources to probe into the source's informational world to establish the legitimacy of the facts, independent of the source's account. Schlesinger 1978, Erickson, Bernick and Chan 1989. Scholars have warned that journalism is increasingly accommodating funding and ownership patterns, work practices and routines that blur the distinction between fact and fiction, selling propaganda in the name of news. In such a scenario, many a times individual reporters find themselves torn between ethical principles they cherish, the foremost being truth-telling and the pressures accruing from the corporate control of the press which dilutes such a commitment. Government sources, party spokespersons, ministers, officials and bureaucrats are considered to be authorized sources of information and the best talking heads to give credibility to a story. The suitability of sources is adjudged through a process of bureaucratized institutional form of authority and knowledge in which editors and sometimes the management decides who will be given space in the news story and which institutions, communities and individuals will be denied such privilege. This is also partly how news maintains social status quo, representing political power as residing in formal institutions of the state and law enforcement agencies keeping the poor and marginalized sections of society in the periphery. It is a clear categorization between the haves and have-nots, the powerful and the voiceless. See Golding, Murdoch, and Schlesinger 1986. In the case of television news, visuals and footage from locations or showing the face of the eyewitness add credibility and a slice of reality to the story as the saying goes, seeing is believing. Besides, television stories construction also involves staging of sources complete with props, lighting, sound and realistic background to make the scene as close to reality as possible. Often, the emphasis is on presentation than on the veracity of information. Moreover, with visual and high-end graphics used in packaging, less credible information or even false information are easily passed off as fact. Publishing news not attributable to any source or under the pretext of unidentified sources is indicative of low-quality journalism which should be avoided at all cost. In the last couple of years, fake news has emerged as a major social issue faced by citizens and governments alike. As the phenomenon of fake news becomes more widespread with platforms like WhatsApp providing easy avenue for their ready dissemination, new technologies and tools are being developed to detect fake news and ensure that citizens can ensure the veracity of information they consume. Zhu and Zafrani, 2018. The onus lies with both news organizations as producers of information and citizens as consumers of information to push for truth-telling in the public domain. This will not only ensure the criticality of information in the public sphere and its parallel strengthening of democracy but also serve to safeguard ethical principles that are definitive of journalism as we know it for hundreds of years. Side 2013. 2.4 Summary. In the unit, we have discussed in detail the various sources that journalists use to report a news story. It recounts the history of the emergence and consolidation of international and national news agencies and how the wire copies have always served as a staple of news that feeds into newspapers and television. It further explores the other sources of information that reporters routinely turn to, like interviewing individual newsmakers or reporting on events as they happen on the ground. Usually official sources find a privileged place in news when compared to the less powerful and marginalized groups and communities. In doing so, news has traditionally served to mirror and maintain the social structures and differences, including the biases in society, instead of challenging these stereotypes and domination that favor the rich and the powerful. This major shortcoming of news is complicated in a digital era where fake news and misinformation is being peddled in the name of journalism. It posits a real danger to the future of journalism and democracy, making it imperative that we develop tools and fact-checkers that can detect fake news early enough to prevent its wide dissemination. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.